Hello, my name is Eric Zussman, and I am a research director at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Hayama, Japan. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the recently completed United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly ran from September 15th through October 2nd. Physically, it was hosted at the UN in New York, but due to the COVID crisis, most of the events were held virtually. The main theme for the UNGA this year was the future we want, the UN we need, reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism. And what I'm going to do in this brief verbal commentary is highlight a few points. I'd like to first start off by just providing a brief overview of the UNGA for this year in particular. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals during the UNGA. I will then continue to highlight 5 different related crises that were mentioned in many different interventions during the UNGA. And then I will close by talking a little bit about some of the actions, pledges that have been made on the climate change crisis in particular during the UNGA. So without further ado, let me go to my first slide. And so I think one of the key things to underline here is this was not just any meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. This was the 75th session, and it was meant to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations. That was done following on the heels of World War II. And so many of the remarks, including from the Secretary General, the UN, Antonio Guterres, as well as many heads of state, underline the fact that the UN was created out of an attempt to deal with a major global crisis. Now, 75 years in, it's also working on another major global crisis in the case of COVID-19. Much of the discussion at the UN at the UNGA has underlined by this overarching theme, focused on the significant potential to strengthen international collaboration to deal with a range of different global crises. At the same time, there were also clear signs of distrust and isolationism, and some countries directly or sometimes implicitly criticizing the UN for the lack of effectiveness in dealing with some of these crises. And so the meetings that were held over this 2-week period, some of them had very focused themes. And one of the key themes was the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a big area of research here at IGES. And so let me just briefly remark on some of the things that became apparent or were discussed in terms of the SDGs. So coming out of last year's UNGA, there was a decision made to hold for the next decade of action. This is a period that's going to run from 2020 to 2030. As the SDG started in 2015, this decade of action was supposed to inject new momentum into action on the SDGs. And toward this end, it was decided that subsequent UNGAs, there would be an SDG moment. And so the SDG moment was held on September 18th. And it was held against the backdrop of still some large concerns. One was highlighted at the high-level political forum, as well as the regional versions of this political forum, for instance, the Asia-Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, or APFSD, that the progress on the SDGs is still too slow, and there's still some notable regression on several of the SDGs. In terms of the areas that my institute is most interested in terms of some of the environmental dimensions of the SDGs, these tend to be among the most problematic. Further, and this is perhaps even more disconcerting, is due to COVID and some of the economic stresses and depressions that we've seen. This is the first year where we're actually seeing global increase in extreme poverty. So this is an extremely worrying sign and something that much of the discussion on the 18th and other meetings during the UNGA focused upon. Now, as for this SDG moment on the 18th, this was basically a 4-hour meeting. It was divided up into 3 different parts, an SDG reality check, where many eminent speakers from key international organizations or regional organizations provided an overview of where things stand. This was then followed by interventions from chiefly heads of state on their SDG gaps and plans. And altogether, there were 20 heads of state that presented in this session. In some ways, this mirrored the presentations on the voluntary national reviews. And in fact, in order to present in this session, you had to have presented at least one VNR. Although the interventions were more focused and highlighted by and large the fact that countries were trying to move forward on the SDGs despite the fact that COVID was making things more difficult. So for instance, in the case of Nepal, a country from our region, there was a strong emphasis on the fact that the SDGs have now been mainstreamed into many key policies and plans and budgeting documents. And then there was a closing session, or the third session, that focused on SDGs opportunities and contributions from key stakeholders. And here we had a lot of interventions focusing on change makers or innovative thinkers who were presenting ways that countries and also non-state actors could move forward on the SDGs. So collectively, we had discussion of where we were, what countries are doing, and some of the innovative or change-making ways that we could move forward. I would suggest that the discussion was good, useful, candid, and honest. At the same time, it still leaves many questions on how we're going to move forward on the SDGs. And many of these questions arise in the context of 5 different crises, which were continually brought up during the context of the UNGA. So let me talk about these different crises briefly. And I would suggest, first of all, before getting into any one crisis, that many of these crises are interrelated. So the first one is the climate change crisis. And I think it was highlighted in many different interventions that we're now seeing and experiencing the impacts of climate change. I mean, for many years, this was viewed as something that was going to happen to us. I think the growing consensus now is it's already happening, and we need to do something about it. At the same time, there was also calls for heightened ambition. Some of these, which I will discuss at the end of this presentation, are being met. But there were also growing concerns over the lack of finance. And I would say, unlike some of the pledges to deal with or mitigate climate change or to build resilience to climate change, some of these pledges of finance have been less promising. Now, a second area that was brought up many occasions during the UNGA is what we call a natural resource crisis. And especially there was heightened attention on biodiversity and finance for biodiversity and nature. In this context, it's important to highlight that the UNGA was also, during the course of the UNGA, there was also the first biodiversity summit where there was growing attention on need to put forward post-2020 biodiversity targets. and recognition of the linkages between climate change and biodiversity, and also a lot of discussion of nature-based solutions as ways that could potentially deal with some of the climate change impacts while having co-benefits for natural resource management or biodiversity. Now, a third area, of course, is this public health crisis. And here, much of the attention focused on COVID-related impacts, the fact that the COVID death total was nearly 1 million people, and the fact that I think during the UNGA we went quite a little bit beyond that death toll. But there was also some emphasis on the lack of social protection, especially for the most vulnerable. And this relates not only to COVID, but to other health ailments and impacts. Which brings us to the fourth crisis, which was something that was discussed quite a bit, and this is the inequality crisis. And here there was a lot of discussion, on how COVID was influencing inequalities, and whether environmental crises like the climate crisis and natural resource crisis were also widening inequalities. And beyond that sort of general discussion, there was a more focused discussion on gender issues. The UNGA marked not only the 75th, this UNGA marked not only the 75th anniversary of the UN, but the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Women's Conference. And so there was a full day that was dedicated to discussing the progress made since the Beijing conference 25 years ago, and things that need to be done to move the ball forward. And last but not least, the fifth crisis, I think that was fully on display. And this is clear in the title of the meeting, is this multilateralism crisis. And I think this quote here at the bottom from Antonio Gutierrez succinctly summarizes where things are. The fact that the world has a surplus of multilateral challenges, but a deficit of multilateral solutions. And I think in this context, much of the discussion focused on how we could reform and rejuvenate the United Nations itself, with a greater emphasis on effectiveness and efficiency, but also accountability and transparency within the UN, to build greater trust. And also how the UN could be used as a tool to help strengthen political will to take on many of these crises. So in particular, when it comes to the SDGs or any one of these crises, one of the sort of commonly cited challenges is the fact that politicians might not always be willing to get behind different types of solutions. And we also see, as remarked at the very beginning of this intervention, we also see some distrust and some lack of support from some of the key countries for multilateral solutions. So one of the key things moving forward will be, how does the UN evolve in the face not only of COVID and these crises, but in the face of this deficit of multilateral solutions. And then this will lead me to my last slide, which underlines one of the key developments during the meeting. And this comes in the context of climate change. We had, for instance, during the interventions from heads of state, surprising remarks from leadership in China, Xi Jinping, noting that China will aim to see its CO2 emissions peak before 2030, and then achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It's widely believed that as China updates their nationally determined contribution, this rhetorical pledge will be put down on paper. And then there's, of course, questions about how do we translate that into action. But anyways, the fact that we see a country that is leading the world in greenhouse gas emissions, making this type of pledge at such a high level fora, suggests that there's growing momentum and support to mitigate greenhouse gases. Similarly, we also see some increased ambition from the EU. So there were announcements during the UNGA to raise the ambition of its climate change target from 40% off of 1990 levels to 55% reduction off of 1990 levels by 2030. And so this is also promising, and it seems as if it could lead the way to more ambitious pledges from other countries. Now, at the UNGA itself, of course, the current leadership in the United States was not talking enthusiastically about more ambitious climate commitments. But the backdrop for much of the discussion was sort of a what if the leadership in the US changes after November, and what if a new presidential administration makes good on its commitments to not only re-engage with the Paris Agreement, but also to invest significant sums of money in climate change actions, also targeting some creation of job opportunities, and therefore pairing some of the concerns over climate change with the concerns over social equity issues. Last but not least, one of the more interesting developments at the UNGA was that countries were not the only actors that were making these ambitious pledges. We also saw many private sector actors taking forward or advancing their own commitments. And so, for instance, we see in the case of Walmart, the desire to become carbon neutral by, I believe, 2040. And other companies such as General Electric and PepsiCo also indicating that they're going to reduce their greenhouse gases and their carbon footprints. So this raises the question, of course, over how countries and companies can work together, and how we can sort of bottle some of the energy that we saw, for instance, at the last UNGA in 2019 from civil society, youth groups, some of the stakeholders that are not typically included in these discussions. How can we bring these sort of forces of change together in a way that will not only be good for climate change, but that will be good for some of the other crises that were mentioned previously. And here this raises the question of what might be the role of the UN moving forward in trying to help some of these forces of change coalesce, and help harness some of those energies to drive change at local, national, and global levels. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.